Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you're all here. This is a real treat to visit with my friend Lee Lowenfish, and we're going to talk about Lee's terrific new book, Baseball's Endangered Species. It's a Nebraska Press publication. It's an outstanding book. And for those of you who are new here and not familiar with Lee, Lee's the 2007 Seymour Medal winner for outstanding biography for his work on Branch Rickey, baseball's ferocious gentleman, the definitive biography of the legendary Branch Rickey. And Lee, always great to chat with you. And in the many years we've known one another, and the emails we've swapped and the conversations we've had, scouts have always been very important to you. Where did that come from?
Well, it's great to be here with everyone. And I'm a historian by training, but I'm a baseball fan and writer by blood. I mean, my dad was a dermatologist, and he had baseball umpires as patients. And I got to meet Babe Pinelli, actually. In fact, Dan, you have a little resemblance to Babe. I think that's part of the reason we bonded, besides our great love of scouts. And and he also, I didn't meet Bill Stewart, but Bill Stewart, my father won a workman's compensation case for Bill Stewart in 1952. Leo DeRocher spiked him, and it got infected. And it made the papers, but a little bit, but I've been unable to get documentation on it, but it's part of my blood. Now we fast forward to the 1980s. I'm back in New York, where I grew up. I went to Wisconsin for grad school. I'm still upset with them. They're the only Big Ten team to give up baseball in '92. Craig Counsell was set to go to Wisconsin, to the Badgers, but they disbanded. So he went to Notre Dame, where Pat Murphy was his coach, and now he's rewarded Murphy as he's now his bench coach. Anyway, so I meet in the 80s Billy Blitzer, a Chicago Cubs scout. There's a college game west side here of Manhattan, and I say, that name's familiar. And my father had a patient named Ida Blitzer. He says, that's my grandmother. He says, are you related to Dr. Lowenfish? I'm his son. Well, Billy introduces me to Herb Stein, who signed Viola before the draft, and Gene Larkin, who got the World Series winning hit, my alma mater, Columbia, for the Twins. And then
Carew.
Rod Carew before the draft, Frank Viola, Larkin, Scott Leyes after the draft. And then I meet Ralph DeLulo, becomes one of Blitzer's mentors. And so I started to get into scouting, and then doing the research on Branch Rickey, I knew how important the scouts were. And the first chapter of my book is about Charlie Barrett, Pop Kelchner, and all his scouts who were, when he found them, they were loyal almost forever and ever. And Can He Play? It was a wonderful source for me. So I feel like I'm with my people, as Charlie Weaver would have said, when I'm talking to SABR people. So after the Rickey book, I decided to turn to scouting, and I made more contacts by Branch Rickey got into the College Baseball Hall of Fame in 2009 in Lubbock, Texas. They don't have a building yet, but they have a foundation there. And so I met more scouts there. I met Dick Grote there, rest in peace. And Dick Grote gave me a great interview for the Rickey book, because, Rickey signed him off the campus of Duke. And a very special guy was Dick Grote. And you talk about the family with Rickey. Mazeroski wound up marrying Rex Bowen's secretary, I found out later. So, the whole thing with Rickey was God, baseball, and family. And they were all intertwined. And the more I got to interview scouts, Gene Bennett getting a chapter in my book as well, because he played for the Reds, and then he meets Rickey in his home area of Scioto County near the Kentucky border, and he's been offered a job as a manager in the Reds organization or a scout. And Rickey says, son, you go into scouting, because if you find players, you'll have a job forever. But if you have a bad team, they'll blame you and they'll fire you. Very good advice. And so a few years later, Bennett signs Don Gullett, who he sees in junior high school and hopes no one else sees him, because he was already striking out high school players in junior high. And one of the heartwarming stories in terms of my life in the recent years was going to the banquet for the Portsmouth murals, and Ricky is on it, and a lot of the famous people from the area, not just out of baseball. Among them Roy Rogers, who was born Leonard Sly in Lucasville, and Branch Rickey's son-in-law went to high school with Leonard Sly. So you see the family connection in baseball, and the scouts are the first ones to see that. And the more you know the family background and the makeup of these players, the better you're going to evaluate them as athletes. It seems so obvious, but obviously in the age of analytics, it isn't. So that was my long answer, Dan, to how I got in.
No, it's fascinating. And as you get into it, anybody who writes and does interviews knows that there's always one interview that leaves you walking on clouds for a few days. As you work through this, and I know you interviewed some fascinating people, and I'm curious, was there a particular interview that you were able to land for this book? Maybe someone who was difficult to pin down, or just amazing stories. But was there someone that really left you pretty giddy when you finished?
Well, I'll tell you, first, I'm so glad that Bill Clark is on this screen, because I met Bill Clark at when he was honored by the Gilbert folks, Dennis Gilbert, who was Barry Bonds' agent and others, but he saw the light and he became a great benefactor of the Scouts. And I was really delighted to meet Bill. I wish I had more of him in the book, but I have a little bit. But I think John Cox, who you've never heard of, John Cox was the kind of guy, he was with the Phillies and the Cubs, and he told me a story about Maddox after he had signed, and I was on the phone. He was somebody I couldn't find, and he's up there in age, and then when I found him, he wouldn't stop talking, and I love it, because that's the whole thrill of the chase. It's going back to my dear friend Larry Ritter, who I met when I taught his son Stephen in a quiz section. I was in Madison, and the way Larry found Wahoo Sam Crawford in a laundromat after looking for him. Well, John Cox is not as famous as Crawford, but Cox started out as his father was in the service when he was born, and he was born in the Midwest, and his father, left to see him in infancy. And then when he's 3 years old, John has this memory when Dad comes back from service, says, "Dad, you want to have a catch?" And that lasted with him for the rest of his life. He had grandparents who lived in Detroit, and he'd spend summers in the right field bleachers, rooting for Al Kaline. And so he comes from an area in Iowa, though, where they didn't have a high school team. The father is now going to be moved to Illinois. He doesn't want to do that. So they wind up in California. And so the next thing you know, he's got a tryout with the Angels, and he winds up in the Angel minor league system, never hitting more than 200. But like that shortstop who played for Japan in the World Baseball Classic, he was a great fielder, and there was a job for him. And so he gets traded to the Cubs. And I have all this in the book, and this is the one that opened up so many of the stories for me. And like all historians who are fair-minded about it, I stand on the shoulders of people who wrote such wonderful works before, like my friend Kevin Corain, and I saw on I think the Rod Shelf, Prophet of the Sandlots, Baumgartner's book about Tony Lucadelo. And again, thanks to you, SABR Bioproject people, I learned more about Tony Lucadello and his brother. And again, the family stories. I mean, Tony was sent to live with his brother because his mother from Chicago was afraid he was going to run around with bad people. So again, this is a saga that I just love telling.
Lee, you mentioned John Cox and finally connecting with him and him talking on and on and on. Can there be better storytellers in baseball than scouts? These guys are great.
Yeah, well, it's a calling. I mean, the life is so hard, and I'm not a person who loves to travel because I mean, I lose things at home, and I'm just fearful of losing things on the road where you're not going to get them back. And I don't get around walking that well anymore. But these guys, as Billy Blitzer told me in a piece I wrote for SABR, a dozen years ago, about you got to be a weatherman. I mean, you got to be a travel agent. Yeah, I mean, you really and as Gary Nichols, who they worked together on the Sean Dunston signing that I have in the book, as Nichols told me, the nature of the game is disappointment, and you have to accept that. But you have to know that, as one of the scouting directors, I think it was Joe Consoli of the Pirates, would gather the scouts together, and Consoli would say, "There's a Hall of Famer out there, find him." And that's, in this very cynical, analytical age, I've heard too many people say that's bullshit. We can all do it through analytics, through video, launch angles, exit velocity. I mean, I love the scout who's still employed, so I'm not going to name any names, who said a launch angle and exit velocity is a horseshit pitch that should have been hit 400 feet. So, I mean, that kind of stuff. And I want to debate this because, as I say in the book, I mean, Branch Rickey was asked, "How much of baseball do you know, Mr. Rickey?" And, he said 55%. Now that means he didn't know 45%. And so there's a lot to be learned out there. And unlike other sports, baseball, especially pitching, is right there for the eyes and ears to see. And that's where the great scouts come in, because they penetrate. They really penetrate.
You mentioned Branch Rickey saying he knew 55% of baseball, but what he knew made so many other people in the game, executives in the game, observe what he was doing and follow what he was doing. How important, how influential was Branch Rickey to the profession of scouting?
Well, well, I guess the best example, and I'm glad I can bring it up in this context, today, and at this almost precise moment, 100 years ago today, not one of these, this is the 43rd anniversary of 100 years ago at this moment, Lou Gehrig was signing in front of Paul Critchell, Ed Barrow, and Rupert in the Yankee offices. And 8 years later, after Connie Mack was in 3 World Series in a row, winning 2 of them and losing the 1 in 31 to Pepper Martin and the Cardinals, Rupert and Barrow are saying, especially Rupert, you got to outdo this farm system of Branch Rickey, and they did, and that's what the first part of my book is about: the rivalry between Rickey's Cardinals and then the Dodgers and the Yankee farm system. And it's so, and I'm glad, in terms of, the picture on the cover is Tom Greenway, who, and when he was a Dodger. I mean, people forget he signed Mantle, and he signed Hank Bauer and Vernon and Elston Howard. But before that, he worked with the Dodgers, and he signed Rex Barney and and the man with the greatest name, I think, in baseball history, Calvin Coolidge, Julius Caesar, Tuskahoma. He became a good scout and a coach. And so a lot of scouts worked for different organizations, but their goal was to bring people who could play, as the book 10 years ago, can he play? And the good scouts knew it better than I think a lot of people, today.
There was a great loyalty to Branch Rickey. Before we began the program, we were chatting a little bit with Rod about Rickey men, but whether St. Louis, Brooklyn, Pittsburgh, even the Continental League, these scouts went with him wherever he went. Was it that he fed the challenge that they liked? What was it about the loyalty that you've been able to put a finger on?
Well, that's a very good question. It's he was very paternal. I mean, he understood the cost of being away from home. I mean, I think he was a homesick kid. The story he told and the way I began my biography was, after him dying, giving a speech on courage. I mean, he lived by that precept of, he told a reporter in 1906, a college reporter, about, because he was not playing on Sundays, he was going to church and the Bible. And can religion hurt a player? And he got it, and he really didn't like the question. He said his goal was he wanted to be a consistent player and manager, owner, and a consistent Christian. And I think he lived up to that. What made it a challenge, and which a lot of people don't want to look at the complications. I found this great quote about after they beat the A's in the 31 World Series, a Philadelphia reporter, Gordon Mackey, said he has the face of a deacon, the manners of a diplomat, and he can get in and out of your pockets without mussing a hair. And so I think a lot of the scouts really appealed. They were really taken into that. As another writer said, another player said, he can make salt taste like sugar in your mouth. I mean, he was really incredible in that regard. And Branch's grandson, who has a lot of his mannerisms and is really a very profound guy in his way too. He said the favorite speech he would ever give, talking about his grandfather, was the one about the six abides. And he had 5 daughters and 1 son, and it was about being a family man. And so there was that avuncular quality of him to him that really appealed. And then the other sides were the Howie Hakes and the Leo DeRochers. And DeRocher was, the great line about DeRocher was that he was the Horatio Alger story written by Mickey Spillane. And a lot of people have never heard of Spillane these days. But that was Rickey. He wanted to convert people. And I found a letter in the Library of Congress where Grace Dozier, who was the dressmaker for Mrs. Rickey, Jane Rickey, after she divorces Leo, she writes Branch a letter saying, now that they're going to work together in Brooklyn, that she hopes that he can reform him and bring him back. So it's fascinating stuff that only a profound novelist can get into, but I try to suggest. So he's an absolutely enduring character, and I'm really glad at the Jackie Robinson Museum that I went to for the first time last week. There is the letter of exchanges between Rickey and Robinson, where Jackie is right after he's in Pittsburgh, says, "One day I would like to be with you if it works out in baseball." And so there's so many levels there. And 42 was good, but it was really just the start.
Bertie Tebbetts. I mean, it was wonderful to see you illuminate him, because I've heard so much about him through the years, and most don't know about his passion for the men and the few women who have made up the scouting profession. Talk a little bit about Bertie Tebbetts, if you would.
Yeah, well, I met him once when I was doing radio, and uh, it's funny, in the context of Leo DeRocher as Horatio Alger, a story about Tebbetts that came out in the 36 newspapers when he made the major leagues. They referred to him as a Horatio Alger story because he lost his father when he was 3. He was raised by a lot of uncles and was baseball mad, was the mascot for the Nashua Millionaires, a very top semi-pro team, including collegians uh, from the good schools. I mean, the good baseball schools. And by the time he was 10 or 11, he was, before the games, he was imitating the Millionaires catcher Clyde Supforth during the warm-ups. And so he's he's the best catching prospect in the country. And Critchell actually comes to visit his mother. And but the mother, the widowed mother, wants him to go to college, and she doesn't. She basically tells Critchell goodbye, and he writes her a letter that the family saves, saying, "Oh, we don't want to interfere with his education, but we just think he's a fine young man." Well, the Tigers sign him. The same scout that signed Hank Greenberg, John DeBook, signed Tebbetts. He plays at Holy Cross, and you talk about the luck of the game. He was injured a lot in college, so he only really played 1 year in college, but he finished. He was a philosophy major. He was no dummy, and the Tigers signed him. And this little book that I picked up, online, his Birdie, that came out after he died. It was edited. He kept a diary of all his experiences, and he really he had enough gumption to write Mickey Cochran about, when am I going to get up, and can you help me with my hitting, because it's very demanding. And Cochran actually wrote a reply. So he was and so his career, the hardest thing in the book, by the way, Dan, was to keep that story short, because he's the one that pushed for scouts in the Hall of Fame. And I vowed I'm not writing another 600-page book, and you could, because Tebbetts, I'm learning more about him since the book came out. I got this great letter from Peter Bavasi, who grew up in Dodgertown and grew up with the Dodgers and grew up with Rickey people. And he told me that Tebbetts, went after he managed and he had the heart attack and he had to leave the field, but he became a scout evaluator. He helped in the 80s, Pat Corrales, develop an Indians team that was decent, and he didn't want any credit for it. And so he really was one of those guys behind the scenes who deserves to be remembered. And I hope someone, maybe not me, does more about him, because it's a great story. And another catcher, like Berra, like Torrey, Madden, there's nothing like the catchers who see it all. Next to the scouts, the catchers see it all, man. The only ones that look out at the field.
You touched on the 4 types of scouts in the book, with the most rare being projectors. And one guy also that you illuminated in the book was Red Murph. Oh. And of course, Red worked a very fertile territory there in Texas, but will always be linked to maybe his greatest sign, and that being Nolan Ryan. Touch on Red Murph a little bit and what you developed on him.
Well, Red Murph, again, I love to dig in the sources that are not that combed. And I found Red Murph's book, The Scout, written with Mike Capps, whose brother, Billy Scout, or his cousin, I think, was a good Cub Scout. And Mike Capps is a broadcaster in Texas, and Red Murph signed him. He didn't have a big career. I found that book in a remainder pile at the Hall of Fame, and Murph Murph played for the Milwaukee Braves. He was 35 years old when he made his debut with the Milwaukee Braves in 1956. He may have been the oldest pitcher ever to break in, certainly one of them. He was sent back to the minors in 57, so he wasn't on the team that won the World Series, but they gave him a ring. And then he knew he wanted to stay in baseball. He was from the oil territory of Texas, and he never really developed a sense he could be a baseball player until he went into the Army during World War II, stationed stateside. And so after he gets out of the minor leagues, where he was a pitcher coach, he developed Phil Niekro, and Phil Niekro thanked him at the Hall of Fame when Phil got in. He starts scouting for the Houston Colt 45s. He finds Ken Boswell, who they let go. Not Boswell, I'm sorry, Jerry Grody.
Right.
And then he picks up Grody for the Mets. He picks up Boswell. He also picks up Koosman. Another wonderful example of you got to be out there and brave your disappointment and meet people, talk to people. And he found Koosman because an usher at the new Shea Stadium said that his son was catching Koosman at Fort Bliss in El Paso. And you take a look, and he likes what he sees, but he practiced tough love. He said, "Lose some weight, son," and he did. And that's how Koosman became a Met. And in that book, The Scout, he has this great phrase about scouting is a brotherhood without the secret handshakes, and that's why I was determined to get into this as much as I could, because Tabbitt's book, as I said, was published after he died. I mean, he probably wouldn't have liked the way it came out because they were secret. And when Critchell in his heyday gave an interview, which was very rare, he would say, make sure whenever you make a public comment, it's the organization that signs it, not you. And so, like the Yogi Berra documentary is getting distribution, and it's definitely worth seeing. And I was checking out, who signed Berra. It's not clear. I mean, it could have been Bill Essick. That's worth digging into. But the reason Ricky didn't sign him or gave Garagiola more is, I'm pretty sure it's because Ricky knew he was done in St. Louis much earlier than when he left. Sam Braden, once he retired from the auto business, but made him a millionaire, he decided he didn't want to pay Ricky what he was paying. Ricky was really, in his heyday with the Cardinals, was the highest paid person in baseball when you add up the bonuses he got. So Braden didn't want anything to do with that. And by 1940, when he was making decisions, firing one of Ricky's people as an accountant in a minor league team, and then firing Ray Blades as manager, and Southworth coming in without Ricky knowing, that's the background why he probably didn't offer Berra more, because he hoped to sign him in Brooklyn. But by then, Berra had the commitment to the Yankees.
When we look at the profession today, there are schools anybody can go to learn to be a scout. And when I compare that to the profession through the 30s, 40s, 50s, and maybe a degree of the 60s, you're talking about, the money in the game was different. So a lot of people that had been managers became scouts, and really the basis of their evaluating was what they had been through as a manager. Touch a little bit on the profession, and really what are some of the factors that go into making a successful scout?
Well, that's a big question. And the good teams, I think, to a fault, have kept their scouts. Under the commissioner's office that wants to control everything, they had a scout school. A lot of people who became good scouts came out of it. They did away with that. I'm happy in the last chapter of the book, I mentioned Kelly Rodman, who was a graduate of the Scout School and was a full-time Yankee Scout, was a big advocate for Volpe. We have two pictures of her in the book, and she got a brain tumor and passed away 3 years ago, the age of 44. And other scouts came out of that program as well. But the good teams, the Astros have added scouts after they were the poster boy to get rid of advanced scouts. I don't know the answer. I've asked around and I've not gotten the answer. I wonder if the Yankees have done away with their advanced scouts, because they have signed a lot of pitchers lately who have broken down or not, and that's why the scouts want infield. They want, the game is so hard, but the way it became a great game is that it's visible. I mean, it's not dunking. It's and you want to see in infield who seems to be lollygagging with the throw, who seems to be limping. They don't have that anymore. I mean, I remember as a kid going to see Willie Mays at the Polo Grounds. We'd get there early and he would throw to every base. And today it's a lot different. And the thing about baseball that we love is that it's filled with argument. And as I quote Bobby Winkles in the book, who was a great college coach, not and another Illinois Wesleyan guy like Gary Nichols and Jack Sikma and Doug Rader. I mean, Winkles used to say that half the fun of baseball is laying blame. So, we can all lay blame. But let's not think we have all the answers. But I will say that you cannot put develop players through video alone. But I know why it's happening, because the hedge fund managers that own most of these teams have hired these people from the Ivy League and the business schools, and they're talking the same language. And but I'll say definitively that that alone is not going to develop contending teams. And I think what you're seeing now is such a bunch of bad teams. I think it proves my point.
Well, you're right. And I think we're going to see a reduction in talent. We're going to see a reduction in polished skills. You're absolutely right. Rod, I'm wondering if this is a good time to open it up to those who want to ask questions and engage in conversation.
Well, I think Ryan's asked a couple of really good questions there in the chat. Lee, what kind of reaction are you getting in the first month on the book? And Ryan asked, what makes it so groundbreaking?
Well, I've tried to look at the history and bring it up somewhat to the present. I mean, I would, and in terms of reaction, I hired a publicist in Tampa who's really got me on a lot of radio shows, and most of them were very good. Rob Dibble in Hartford, who's a regular now, and his background, his father was a newsman in Hartford, gave me a great interview. I had some good ones in Boston, Chicago, nicely. The one in Redlands, California, wanted me to postpone, but he said he liked the picture of Koufax on the cover. And he never got back to me, so I didn't lose sleep over that, but what I was trying to do in the book was to tell baseball history through scouting eyes, while telling the story of these remarkable guys who are far more interesting and talented than Moneyball made them out to be. Because, Moneyball, the book, and then the movie cost dozens, maybe hundreds of scouts their jobs. and that's wrong, and trouble with the curve, which I've seen a couple of times, tried to correct it, and it had its moments. It was a little bit, too formulaic, but it certainly was inspired by how Moneyball was really unfair to the scouts. As one of them said, the only thing accurate about scouts in that book was that the mother of Billy Bean wanted him to go to Stanford.
A quick little tidbit, Lee, you and I have discussed it. The scouts who were in the movie Moneyball, the real scouts, one of them, Artie Harris, was assigned the task of assembling scouts for that movie. And he made a point of getting together scouts who had lost their jobs because of the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rod, I saw, I think Paul was hammering out a question. Maybe Paul would want to jump on mic and ask it.
Hi, Lee.
Hi, Paul.
Nice talking with you. We got to get together and talk about scouts. I'm new to this. I'm a total virgin, so be gentle with me. I want to talk about what's going on here in Baltimore and the new Orioles zeitgeist, I call it. They seem to be going backwards to the old Oriole way and finding kids. And I'd be really interested to find out how are they finding these kids like Jackson Holliday, Gunderson, Mountcastle, Audley Rushman, all of these guys, these young kids that are really developing very quickly. 18, 19, 20-year-olds, they're coming up real fast. And they've got Hispanic players that are coming up as well. And I'm just wondering what your take is with that. How are they doing that? It's great that they're going backwards to the old Oriole way of they're going to bring up Jackson Holliday real slowly. They've got him in high A right now, and they're probably going to keep him down for another couple of years till he really gets his swing. But he looks like he's going to be a fence buster. Just want to know what you thought.
Well, believe me, I'm an Oriole fan.
Hope so.
And for over a half century, and I'm willing to eat crow. It's only April, but you're right. I mean, Rushman. It was down to Rushman versus Bobby Witt.
Yeah.
And Rushman. I'm because I don't want to be a wimp here. I mean, I am willing to say as long as Rushman stays healthy, the Orioles are going to be at least a 500 team because the way he approaches the game. I mean, he's really you just see the intelligence that and last year he didn't seem to be hitting well right-handed. He seems to be improving that way.
Yeah.
With my one concern with the Orioles is that the ownership is in such disarray. I mean, and the ownership is the suit of the younger brother versus the older brother and the mother is over, but they still got to pay a lot to the Nats for the cable money. And their payroll, the Oriole payroll, is not much above Oakland. So for now, I'm enjoying this to the full, and everything that Paul said, they're a wonderful team to watch. I mean, Cedric Mullins is and Jorge Mateo, they're the igniters, and what's fascinating is that they can ignite out of the lower part of the order as well as the upper part of the order. The thing is, though, and this is true, like in the Pirates with a lot, didn't have any good year until this good start. How you get the fans back, because they've been hit so hard, but and the fact that the big free agents will still go to the high dollar payroll places. So it's much too early to judge that. But I certainly, like you, Paul, I'm very enthused. And as you look back at that draft, I mean, Holliday was considered only one of 5 top choices, and he looks like the real deal. In fact, I may schlep to Coney Island to see him next week against Brooklyn because I saw him in spring training, and the thing about baseball is that, especially now with the media, so as Larry D'Amato, I see, has joined this. I mean, Larry has this great line about to be a scout, all you need is a camera and a radar gun.
Yeah.
And what you need is mentorship, and so, but I'm surprised, happily surprised, that the Orioles, that group that come out of Lunau in Houston, seem to be headed in the right direction. The big decision soon is, who are you going to keep and who are you going to trade? And like Gunnar Henderson is really having a slow start. And he was supposedly the top prospect, and there may be better fielders coming along.
Watch out. Austin Hayes is tired of going down to the minors.
Yeah.
And you just watch. He's beefed up. He's starting to find his swing, and he doesn't want to go down. So watch what happens with Austin Hayes. That's my sleeper prediction as far as the Orioles is concerned. What I really like was the fact that they cleaned house. Machado, everybody, Andrew Jones, everybody. They got rid of all the high dollars. They brought it all back down to zero. And they just said, bear with me, people. And this was before COVID. And of course, 2 years with COVID, that was just terrible for the Orioles, for every team. But they started building, and they started getting the draft picks, and they've got the top 10 draft picks that are coming up. You watch DL Hall is going to come up probably by
He's up today. He's up today right now as the 27th man for that doubleheader.
Yes.
Yeah. He's playing right now. Actually, you're so important to me. I haven't even put on, I follow the Orioles pretty seriously, but and what's sad though too is what happened to the Nats. I throw my hands up because the history of the baseball business is fascinating on one level, and it's so maddening on another level, because it's always the story as a business of the strong eating the weak. But in the case of Lerner, somebody who knows Lerner told me he decided after they won it all in 2019 that they were never going to draw any more fans. So let's get out of here. But he's not selling yet, and neither is Marino, who's done a botching job out there. So they're not getting as much as they want. So I don't know. But I absolutely, the way you build, and I think the Mets are going to learn this the hard way. You build by identifying young players with ceilings. They may not all succeed, but a guy in his later 30s is on his way down. And I'm afraid that why sign a Tommy Pham
I'm just thinking, we're sitting here in the scouts committee. Some scout must have had some really prescient knowledge and got all four of these guys that we're talking about: Henderson, Rushman, DJ Hall, Jackson Holiday. They saw these kids, they saw what was necessary, and somehow they got them all to the Orioles, which is propitious, and can't find the adjective that I'm looking for, but it's prescient is the only one that comes to mind.
Well, the reason why I think humility is important, and of course in America in 2023, I've always called Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey naive pioneers. They thought that this was going to change America. It did slightly, and we're going backwards. But I'll be a naive pioneer about baseball. About Rutschman, everyone knew this was going to be a very interesting, good player. Henderson, they get credit for because he's a high school guy.
Mm-hmm.
And evidently, if I read this correctly, it's a great story. His older brother, who may be in someone's minor leagues, is an Oriole fan, and Gunnar couldn't wait to come to the game and do all with the national anthem at the end, so I love that story. But the Dan Duquette regime signed Hall and Rodriguez, and also both out of high school.
Well,
Uh,
it's just
you know,
looking really good now.
Yeah.
It's just really looking good finally for a change.
Yeah.
The Nationals will come around. They'll take care of their stuff, and they'll come around.
Right, Paul, to be continued, and I'm really, with your background in music, today is Duke Ellington's his 124th birthday.
That's
To
correct.
know your music career, and I was talking to one of Duke Ellington's last trombonists, and all the musicians of the heyday of the 30s, 40s, 50s were baseball fans, because the games were in the daytime, and they could see the games, and they'd play at night.
Sure. I said in my book that between 1900 and 1950, all kids in America either wanted to be baseball player or jazz musicians. And they were the most famous people at the time. I think there's a great intersection. And when I went to the Nine convention on 2020, right before the pandemic hit, I met a guy there who was doing just that. He wanted to juxtapose jazz musicians with baseball. Of course, you know that Louis Armstrong had a team, a black baseball team for a little while, but he wanted to make a connection like that. He was going to talk to me, never called me, whatever. But I think that's a great idea. Jazz musicians and baseball players, how much sway they had between 1900 and 1950.
Duke actually, the saxophone solos he used an acronym at bat. The order was alto, tenor, baritone, alto, tenor. So I love that story too. Good to see you.
Nice to see you. We'll talk.
Ryan, you've posted some great questions on the screen. Any you want to jump in and toss at Lee? Rod, I don't know if we lost him.
He's there, but he's muted.
Oh, he's muted.
There he goes.
I'm here. I'm here.
Great.
Yeah. Yes. Hi. So who, in your opinion, would be the greatest scout of all time, or who would be on the list?
Joe Cambria.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Tom Greenway, Charlie Barrett, Paul Critchell, George Genovese. I mean, it's really hard. It's really hard to name, one. I mean, my great friend Ernie Accorsi, who loves baseball more than football, said that he would love to meet the scout who signed Ron Say and Yogi Berra. And Say actually was signed by the guy who wound up with Seattle, and who
signed by Bill Brenzel.
Yes, Larry.
Yeah.
Yes, Larry. Put the video on. Larry was you talk about each one teach one. Larry was introduced to me by T-Bone Giordano, who was Bill Enos's supervisor, and so it's the brotherhood.
Definitely was signed. Ron Sain was signed by Bill Brenzel, for the Dodgers. He's from Tacoma, Washington.
Is it Bill Brenzel that there's a collection of all of his papers at the Hall of Fame?
Yeah,
Am I thinking
the
of
same Bill
somebody
Brenzel.
else?
Yeah.
No, I think you're thinking of the. No, I know. I went through those papers. Yeah, it's the Senators Scout
Right.
and the Rangers
It's-
Scout. He sounds
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah,
So
Rand, oh, I have it in my notes.
Yeah,
Bill also signed Bill Buckner
Yeah.
too.
yeah. And it's Joe Branzel.
Joe
Branzel's
Joe
the one.
Brenzel with the Senators.
And I think another appeal of Ricky and Joe Branzel, they were very religious people, and the Scouts, on the road so much, they were attracted to people who loved the game, to give up a normal family life, but they were aware of the temptations of the road. I mean, when I interviewed Vince Scully for the Rickey book, he talked about, as he was being hired by the Dodgers, that was the last year that Rickey was in Brooklyn. You know, Rickey didn't talk about baseball. He talked about morals, you know, and that was an appeal to a lot of people. And speaking of Scully, if you go to a Fordham game at that lovely field in the Bronx, right across from the Botanical Gardens, you hear the tape comes on, "Welcome to Fordham baseball." You know, they have a tape of Scully up there at the Fordham game.
Ryan or anybody else with questions or conversation for Lee?
I have
Lee?
a, go ahead.
No, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead.
You sure? Oh,
After you,
first,
after you.
okay. First, just a quick thanks, Lee. Years ago, Milt Thompson introduced us, and you gave me some advice. At the time, I was working on a project, and you kind of reiterated it here today when you talked about, you know, diving into those people who aren't the most obvious and doing the interviews, because you get some great stuff. And over the years, I found ushers and parking attendants at ballparks have some of the greatest stories I've ever seen. So I want to just thank you. Years ago, you gave me that advice, and want to say thanks. The quick question I had was, it kind of strikes me that in some of the areas of where there's less developed in less developed countries, in places where you're looking at players who are very younger, those old-fashioned scout skills still matter. And as opposed to the analytics that we see, you know, maybe when they're looking at younger people in the US. And the example I'm thinking of is Ethan Salas, who the Padres signed this past year. There's no way anybody had launch angle data on this kid. He was only, you know, 16 at the time. And I went back and watched him in spring training this year on the back fields. And I was just amazed at how mature this kid was, you know, and that took the old-fashioned kind of observation that you talk about in your book, and that you've talked about today. That's not going to show up anywhere on the kind of metrics that people are valuing so much today.
Well, I quote early in the book Julian Mock, who I never met, but I talked to on the phone, and there was a chapter in Peggy and Phyllis Draxet's Eye for Talent, a really wonderful book of interviews with scouts, where Mock, before he hired a scout, would ask 4 questions. And I took it to mean players too. And I think it applies to both scouts and players. You know, do you really love this game? I mean, are you willing to work harder than you've ever worked in your life? Are you willing to learn? I mean, can you, if your pitchers are getting hit out of the yard, can you change your arm angle or your grip? Are you willing to have fun and laugh every day? Because as one of the high school catchers told me, you were a college catcher when I first started this book, about the game is designed to beat you up. And again, disappointment and moving forward. The last thing he didn't phrase as a question, but will you never forget where you come from? Because there's when you assess players, and you know, early in the book when I quote Bertie Tabbitt's rules for scouting about a player can change very quickly, especially pitchers and especially bullpens year to year. And there's a quote that I heard in discussion with Jack Dunn III when he was working with the Orioles. His grandfather sold Babe Ruth to the Red Sox. And I didn't want to believe it. This was at the beginning of his free agency. But now I believe it too often. And he was quoting Eddie Arcaro about, it's hard to get up early in the morning when you're wearing silk pajamas. And when you're scouting and when you're signing people, you have to those are key questions. And in talking to Tony Lamasio, who I met, you know, through T-Bone and through Larry D'Amato and Billy Blitzer, he told me about when they interviewed Tom Glavine and his father was there. He knew the father had an injury from football, so there was no football for young Tom. But Tom was a very good hockey player, and he had an NHL deal and a college scholarship at UMass Lowell. But when Glavin took the meeting by himself, his father just sat in the corner. They knew this guy had a head on his shoulders, and they wanted, where am I going to go? Warm weather. How fast might I move up? And then when I interviewed Glavin years later, he said they learned to be the team they became when they learned to lose together and then win together. And by contrast, the scouts who interviewed Matt Harvey's father sort of ran the meeting, and as another great retired scout, Mike Toomey, says, when I started out, the players were just simply asked, where do I go and when do I start after the draft? Now, what round, how much? And you have to be aware of that. And I am and the good teams will be, and the ones who are run by bean counters won't be. So.
And I saw you with your hand up. Great to
Yes.
see you, and jump in.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank Lee. It has been delightful working with him over the last 2 years on the book, and everyone should read it. But I also want to say hello to Mr. Clark, because I feel as if I know you. Your article about scouting, the foundation of Major League Baseball, is a classic. If anyone hasn't read it, this really explains what a scout does, or at least in the olden days, His scout is many things, and he goes into everything. He's also a weatherman. He's a wagerer. He has to risk the bank, the account of the team. And he's also a ghost, because he might be next to you 1 minute and the next minute he's somewhere else. Either he's taking another look at a player, or he's off to another game. So thank you, Mr. Clark, for writing that article. It certainly is a classic. And I think Dad worked with you in the Seattle Pilots in '69. Is that correct? Did you work for the Pilots?
Am I on? Yeah, I'm on. I tell you what, thanks for the intro. I've been sitting here listening to a very close friend and a guy who I worship on my knee, and that's Lee Lowenfish. I had the good privilege of spending a day with Lee when he was here to talk about Ricky as the program for the State Historical Society of the state of Missouri. And one of the most enjoyable days I ever spent in baseball, and I was out of baseball by that time. But I listened here, and I'll get back to the question in a second. I listened to Lee talk about analytics and so forth. I've been out of baseball 19 years. It'll be 20 years at the end of this 2023 season. I've stayed very close to the game. One of the reasons I'm not in the game is because I tried to start an umpires or a scouts union. And I can tell you that plantation owners do not care for people who try to start scouts unions. And I've been called a cancer in the game by a couple of owners through the years. But anyway, what was the original question?
It was about Bill Enos. And
Oh,
you,
yeah, were you in with the
Pilots.
Pilots in '69 with him?
Yeah, I was
For
a
a
pilot.
year.
I was a pilot in 1969. I have the honor and privilege of being a scout with T-Bone. Giordano was there.
Yeah, right.
And Bill Enos and yeah.
Ray Swallow. Ray Swallow.
Yeah, Ray Swallow, sure.
Yeah.
And and Art Perrick was the baseball operations director. And Art and I worked on the newspaper here in Columbia when we were both in the School of Journalism. So as somebody said, the world gets smaller the longer you go around it. But I grew up in baseball as a Branch Rickey person. And I never deviated from that. If you could run and throw, those were genetic tools. You measure those genetic tools. And if they don't have those genetic tools, the only teams that will sign somebody that without those genetic tools are teams that are failures. So Ricky's theory that you have to be able to run and throw and be an excellent athlete before you're a prospect, I think still remains quite true in our game today. And somebody mentioned what happened in Latin America, where you have no real, well, the agents have changed that somewhat, but you had no real chance to see a player play in a game, because when I worked 12 years only in the international world, that was my only, I didn't see a game in the United States for 8 years in one stretch. Yeah, you went back to those basic genetic tools. And when a kid's 14 or 15 years old, you would see him in just a workout. It was amazing how when a 15-year-old shows you the athletic ability that you can project, wide shoulders, maybe skinny, but wide shoulders, long, loose arms, it's there. The foundation was there, and you went to the next step. You had them run. And if they could run, then you went to the next step. Can they throw? And it didn't matter whether they were a pitcher, a catcher, or a position player. If they could throw, if they were catchers, then you gave a little bit on running speed, but the arm had got to be even better. And pitchers, we even ran pitchers. Every try, I ran over 1,000 tryout camps in my career, and we always ran the pitchers twice in the 60-yard dash, because who knew if you had a pitcher with a good arm and he could run and showed athletic ability, you wound up putting him at third base like, yeah, I can't remember who we had to go to play third base, but anyway, you get the idea. Analytics. I've been a columnist here in Columbia. I'm in Columbia, Missouri. I'm an old J school graduate. Written a couple of books of my own, but not about baseball. And but I've been a columnist. Was a columnist for the Columbia Tribune here for 17 years until I got I got fired for accusing the sheriff of profiling, because he was. So I at the age of 85, I bought my first computer. I'd never had a computer to that point. And so I've done now about 1,500 columns on that computer. I've done about 5,000 columns in the last 19 years since I left baseball. And about every 6 months or so, I go back and analyze analytics for the baseball fan. And I make the point that I don't need a radar gun. I need a stopwatch and a fungo bat. And with a stopwatch and a fungo bat, in my eyes and my judgment, I can outperform any analytics you put out there, because those analytics are based on basically exactly what I'm doing with a stopwatch, a fungo bat, and my own judgment. And I defy any of our Ivy League executives to outmatch that. So I've had my say.
What a great treat to hear that and for you to share that with us. Thanks, Bill. That's fantastic. Larry, were you trying to weigh in a little bit ago?
Yeah, I was going to say hello to Bill Clark. Bill Clark and I worked together in Cincinnati for a long time, and Bill ran a lot of tryout camps in which I did, and Bill came up with a lot of players through the tryout camp system. And we, as he said, we were all groomed on the Ricky system, running and throwing. If you can't run, you can't score runs. You can't throw runners out. If you buy the bat, you die by the bat. That was the philosophy over at Cincinnati, and that's why we were very successful in the 70s.
Does anyone have any ideas on how you can find new owners in Cincinnati and Pittsburgh and Oakland and
Play the lottery.
yeah. Sad.
Frustrating. It really is.
I got a question for both our veteran scouts here. I know how the research community feels about it, but I'd like to know how the scouts feel about it. The reason that I've been tirelessly working on a database for over 20 years to document signing scouts is that I not only do I think that scouts need to be recognized, but I think that there needs to be accountability, dollar sign on the muscle. Who made that decision? So I don't think that it would be so difficult in this day and age to make that information more visible. Now, Casey Stengel always said you can look it up. Well, you can't look it up. It's not on Baseball Reference. I mean, if you want to fish it out of media guides, etc., good luck. Okay, but that may go back, as far back as the draft. But what about everything before that? So it's really complicated, and I've done the work. Okay, and with a lot of help from SABR biographers like Bill Nowlin and the other authors like Dan. And I know that the research community would love to see it. It would be a revelation. Nobody's asked for it. But when they see it, they're going to love it. And that is that all the transaction data that we have about signings, about player acquisition, if we can tie that to a person and a scout, as well as a scouting director and a general manager, then we can understand who's responsible for the dollar sign on the muscle. And the things that are unseen will become known. And then maybe we can start to analyze that. Somebody the other day said, oh, look at this. We've now got war is now posted on some ballpark scoreboard. What? As if 3 digits tells you something about a ball player, that you're going to sit there in your seat and that's going to tell you something. When a player comes to bat, I want to know, who is he? Who is this guy? How old is he? Where's he from? That biographical stuff. But the thing that ties it all together is who signed him. So this committee has done a pretty good job of trying to simplify the unseen things. And the book was asked the question, can he play? And that's the people that make that judgment. That's the people who we need to know more about. So how would scouts feel if all that who signed who data was more visible? Because it can be if it's tied to those transactions and it's included in the databases like RetroSheet and Baseball Reference, Baseball Almanac. How would the scouts feel about that?
Larry, you want to jump on that one first?
Well, I think, to be very honest with you, it's always been kind of a closed shop when it's become out, when who signs who or what. Mr. Hausman in Cincinnati felt one time that he did not want to get, which I asked him when he's the general manager and president of the club, why didn't the scouts get more recognition as far as who they signed? He thought, and I thought he had a very good answer to the question, is he did not want other organizations rating their scouting staff. Always kept this information confidential. It was known within the organization, not known what outside the organization. Because at that time, organizations would rate organizations on their scouts, take them away from other organizations. Because if they were a producer, naturally you want a producer, not a non-producer in your organization. So that's become, and I think it's going to be very, very hard to find out a lot of this information. A lot of it's not, again, you'll find out it's not printed, it's not posted. It's something that you're going to have to ask each individual scout or an organization who signed who or what.
Well, I'll speak up. I'll speak up.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Bill.
All right. I'll speak up in sort of a different direction. In those 12 years I spent in international baseball, I was the sole decision maker on who was signed and who got how much money. And when I signed a player somewhere in the world, I simply called the office and said, I just signed Joe Blow. And usually I had two questions asked. Well, how much did you give him? And when can he report? And that was the end of the discussion. And I can tell you that some of the players I signed, like Rafael Foucault, for instance, a part-time guy brought him into a workout in the Dominican. What was he, 5'5" or 6 at the most? And he could run, he could really run. And he probably had the best shortstop arm in the big leagues for the years he was there. And he had a little pop in the bat, had a little power for a little guy. And we gave him $8,000. And he played in the big leagues for what, 10, 12 years? In fact, he was the shortstop on the last Cardinal team to win the World Series. And then I signed another player on a workout who was basically under control of Houston, but he came out of their little camp up in the mountains for a weekend, and I nailed him in Venezuela. And his local agent said, well, it'll take a lot of money to sign him. And we agreed on $450,000. And I had him in an hour workout, and we gave him it's your choice. You want to sign this guy? He's got all the tools there. What I didn't know was he couldn't hit water if he fell out of a boat. And anyway, we agreed to $450,000. And 2 hours after I first see the player, I'm in the house and we gave him $450,000. He couldn't get out of the rookie league. And that was my decision. And the way that the ball club looked at it at that time said, well, okay, $8,000, we got a regular big leaguer. $450,000, we got a guy can't get out of the rookie league. You just gave the wrong money to the right person, and so forth. And that was it. And of course, the scouting world in the international business at that time was a lot different than it is today, where you deal with agents. But I really had the strong feeling that if that kid played in the big leagues, I had just as much right to his development because I signed him, and I'd like to see my name somewhere in those statistics. So that's one point of view.
Well, I appreciate that. And I don't know. So it's somewhat divided in the community, but I think that transparency is a good thing, and knowledge is power, and we're going to see to it that that information is more widely known. And so that's the project that myself and Jason, who's on board here today, are actively working on, and we're going to have some revelations this year at the SABR convention in Chicago to show off for everybody.
That's great news.
I'd like to throw another thing in here. I'd like to take credit for the fact that we have this Scouts Committee. It had basically disbanded back in the early 1990s, and I volunteered with Cooperstown, with the Hall of Fame, to put together revive this committee. And one of the persons that popped up was the guy who's the chairman now. And I ran this committee for what, 4 or 5 years, whatever it was. Really got things going again, but I was in the international world, and it required me to be out of the country about 9 months a year. So your current chairman took over with my blessing, and I bowed.
Bill's heard this, and very few other people know this, but how that came to happen, Bill, was when in 2001 at the Milwaukee convention, when I realized that what I had been working on was to bring the big party, the big SABR convention to Denver, Colorado, because I thought I could put on a party for 500 of my best friends, as good as anybody, but I needed to make a mark. And where could I actually go from being a consumer of baseball research and maybe make a little bit of a difference? So I found the deepest, darkest, blackest hole in baseball research, and that is Scouts history. Because, like I said, we have basically every hit, run, and error. We know where people are born and where they're actually laid to rest, but we didn't have it. It's not in the book. It's not in any of these databases. You can't look it up. And so I realized this would be a great place. And what the Scouts Committee had existed, it was an offshoot of the Oral History Committee. And they had collected a bunch of oral histories and had half a dozen people all submitting the same couple hundred names that they got out of $sign on the muscle or Prophet of the Sandlots, and it didn't go anywhere. And so I asked Sean Foreman, how would I start this? And so I started, and I'm still working on it. It's a lifetime project, but here's how I knew that it was my niche, because Bill had just become the chair, and he was knocking out newsletters on a Royal typewriter, hunt and peck method. I could just see him doing it. And I knew that he was traveling the world, and he wasn't a computer guy whatsoever. And I said, it's my job. We want to honor guys like that. And I'm going to figure out how I can do it once I talk to him on the phone. Here's the bottom line, Bill. The first time I called you up and I heard your voice on the phone, I thought I was talking to my own dad, because you sound just like him. We're from Iowa, you're from Missouri.
And I'm old enough to be your dad too. I'll soon be 91.
He sounds just like Toke Nelson. And that's a compliment. And nobody can see it on the camera, but right above my desk here is well, picture Coors Field, but I got a close-up 8x10 of Bill Clark and Roland Heeman, and that's my North Star. And we met here in 2002, you, me, Roland, and Branch Barrett Ricky. And that's what set me on my course. And I have to say that I spent 2 hours, and it was more than that, but a few hours in the presence of Roland Heeman, and it changed my life, because he made me feel like that I could actually make a contribution that maybe would matter. And so that's why I'm doing this, and that's why I'm picking it back up right now. We're going to get 100,000. We have 100,000 of Bill Weiss's questionnaires, and he asked, who signed you? And so a lot of players, it's in one ear and out the other. They didn't pay it no mind. They can't spell it. But then a lot of them, it's the first question that you ask in the oral history, because it really opens the door. Who signed you? And so I've been working on this. We have over 75%. I don't really keep an accurate count. It's a moving target. But of the post 1901 ball players, and we're about to expand it into the minor leagues, because we have 100,000 questionnaires. 75% of them have good, valid data. And so it's going to really open up the eyes of a lot of folks. So with that, that's where we're going. And we've got a big meeting this year at the convention, and that's coming up right after the 4th of July.
I'd like to close out my session here by pointing out that my picture on the screen is between two people that I have great respect for. And I'm sorry I used a preposition on the end of a sentence. For whom I have great respect. Okay, Lee. Lee Lowenfish is a godsend to the game of baseball. As a journalist, as a historian, as a person, if there's not a place in Cooperstown in the writers' area for him, he should be there, no question. He is a wonder. And the guy to my left, as I look at this screen, is Bill Nolan. And he was the guy who gave SABR, the Scouts Committee and SABR, the interview that I find on the Patreon website, which is where I deliver my columns through Patreon, that Patreon picked up his bio of me, and it's been there now for 6 years. And everyone who reads about me reads about me through the vision and the journalistic ability of Bill Nolan. And I appreciate you two guys more than you can imagine.
Well, we appreciate you too, Bill. And again, I'm sorry I didn't get more of your story in my book, but I'm glad I didn't bring up the George Barr part, that Bill Enos as a teenager heard George Barr stories, and you were actually a few years later in his school. And I just love that. I love the grassroots and donkey baseball and all that.
Well, thank you, Bill. Nice to see you again.
Okay, better to be seen than viewed, buddy.
Yeah.
And I'll let me add one thing to Lee. I lost most of my baseball notes in a fire, in a warehouse fire about 8 years ago. And I had planned to do what I would call a life in baseball, but not a baseball life. I've had very diverse experience in life with theater and with music and with weightlifting and so forth, and birding and so forth. And around this town where I live, I'm not really known much as a baseball person, but for the other things in life. And I had hoped that I would be able to sit down and review about 50 years as a part-time and 36 years as a full-time scout from the point of view of that scout himself. And when I lost those files, I sort of lost the desire to go ahead with that. But when Rod got in touch with me a month or so ago about this meeting, I thought, you know, I might owe it to the game to put together what I can from the personal point of view. And listening with Lee today, you went a long way towards getting me off my dead ass and back to work. Thank you, Lee.
Well,
And thank you, Bill.
Stay positive.
I'm going to mute so I
Stay
There we
positive,
go.
test negative. That's my magic words right now. Okay. Stay positive, test negative.
Well, we were going to try to wrap up at 11:30. It's 11:38 right now. And so this has been recorded. It's going to be available on YouTube from the SABR Videos account. And so tell your friends about it. And if you haven't completed the questionnaire, please do that. And if you have a chance, if you're going to be at the SABR convention, please come see us at the Scouts Committee. And then also we've got another Zoom meeting scheduled for the end of May. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Bill, do you have some final words?
Not really. I'm going to stop the recording now. People can say what they really think.